My name is Siva Sai Narayana Singh. I'm here to give a presentation on CWE89, which is Common Weakness Enumeration 89 ID of improper neutralization of special elements used in an SQL injection attacks. And my teammates are me, Nivedita, Manuna, and Rajendra. SQL injection is a type of attack where malicious SQL code is inserted into a query to manipulate the database and potentially access sensitive data or alter the database functionality. This occurs when user input is not properly sanitized or validated, allowing attackers to inject malicious SQL commands into a application query. And the weakness ID will be 89, and the attack vector will be externally affected, and the impact will be the attackers can gain unauthorized access, or it may exploit the sensitive information of any database company. And some of the few types of vulnerable in SQL injection are the lack of input validation sanitization, and the weak database permission, and bypassing, where attackers can bypass the authentication techniques or other security measures, which may alter the behavior of the application servers, and no input limits, length limits, where attacker can gain database access with overflow of SQL injection vulnerabilities. And by using the dynamic SQL queries, they can easily have the access, or they can attack easily with concatenating the string and manipulating the database. And some of the significance is it is the list, it's the most common vulnerability, and have in top 25 CWA list. See the image of or a flow chart of SQL injection attack, how this attack will perform, and how the attacker can manipulate SQL query by injecting a malicious code into a web form from an input field. You can see attacker where he can injecting some malicious SQL code into a form field using the user ID and password and website. And some of the common examples of SQL injection attack will be x equal to x, where it will always return true, and it will bypass actual password, and it will forward to the internet and web server, and where again it will forward to the firewall. Here, firewall will use to protect some other type of attacks, but it will cannot stop the SQL injection attack due to it will having the valid HTTP traffic request, and again it will forward to the application server and the web servers, where the application server will construct an SQL query based upon the user input. The SQL malicious code input will be some select star from user, where username equal to ABCD and the password equal to anything, or x equal to x. This injected SQL code x equal to x alters the authentication, and it may bypass the password, and it may connect to the database server. And the database server can be MySQL, Oracle, IBM, DB2, etc. It may execute the query, and without realizing it's been malicious. This this shows how the SQL injection attack will be occurred, and helps to bypass the authentication and retrieve the unauthorized data. Bits of the SQL injection attack. Here you can see one of the example of the code snippet, which is select first name comma last name from users, where user ID equal to percentage, or 1 equal to 1, where 1 equal to 1 means the attacker will bypass the authentication, because it may always return true, and it may extract the data from a application server, and you can see the result output here by bypassing the authentication. Some of the potential impacts and historical SQL injection examples are here. And coming to the potential impact and threats, some of the threats will be data breach, where attackers can have the unauthorized access to sensitive information and database database manipulation, where modifying or deleting the database records, or privilege escalations, where getting the admin access to the system, or authentication bypass, where logging in an user without knowing the password, and the code execution, where attackers can execute some malicious codes into a database server, and it may have the impact will be the data breach, system compromise, reputation damage, and server disruption, and some compliance violation. And coming to the few historic SQL injection examples, which are Heartland Payment System breach at 2028, where this exposes the credit card and debit numbers in the US, where attackers stole over 130 million credit and debit card numbers using SQL injection to bypass while bypassing the authentication and access to the internet and gaining the admin access and sensitive data. And consequences of this loss is the company faced overall 130 million loss, and it may have the reputation damage. And to mitigate this kind of attack, the company needs to build a stronger network and enhanced encryption, and the company needs to monitor continuously and need to address all the vulnerabilities inside the database. And the other historical example will be the Sony Pictures in 2011, where attackers used SQL injection to steal the personal data of millions of users, where this massive breach occurred to steal the personal data of millions of users. And a few other examples will be LinkedIn, where millions of credit cards stolen, and Yahoo in 2012, where 450K users' credentials were stolen. And these attackers or how happen due to by using SQL injection attacks. How to identify the SQL injection attack? Here we can use some common strategies, like you can use some static code analysis to detect some potential injection by scanning the code, or unsanitize the inputs, or you can use the dynamic analysis techniques to perform such as first testing or automated web vulnerability scanners. And we can use some manual testing or error messages from penetration testers. And for mitigations of these SQL injection attacks, will be using prepared statements can be work fine, and we can use some storage procedures and some input validation. We need to ensure input meets the criteria and use a low list and having the limited number of access to the database. And here one of the important mitigation is the least privilege access, where we need to keep the limit of database access to authorized roles to reduce the massive database data leak. For the real world example, I have chosen the CVE 20222421 vulnerability. Here, it may identified in the socket.io parser library, a key component of socket.io framework used for real-time communication. This vulnerability specifies the improper type validation in attachment parsing, and it may impact the several versions of library, namely which is comes under 3.x or 4.x versions. And the significance of vulnerability cannot be overstated. By exploiting the improper validation of this placeholder object, the attacker can achieve the arbitrary code injection, and it may override the objects and manipulate the query object, which may lead to some security breaches, including the unauthorized access of data. Here you can see the code error of CVE 20222421, and how this vulnerability in socket.io framework will work. In the vulnerability occurs due to the improper type validation, which enables the attackers to manipulate the placeholder objects to the reference of JavaScript functions like splice. You can see in the code here, and this may this leads to execute arbitrary code in the server, and this application may be a threat of these functions. And here you can see some examples of how malicious payloads can be injected. The vulnerability bubbles uses the socket.io package itself, meaning if your server listens to a client message like this, you can see you can send some malicious code packets such as these below two examples, example 1 and example 2. Here you can use some push array or you can use some object like a has on property, and you can see following the codes here in this PPT. The vulnerability impact of this CVE 20222421. We can see some of the affected versions, which is socket.io 3.x versions are very vulnerable, and we can see some of the patch versions can be or more or 4.21, 4.0.5, 3.3.3, and 3.4.2, and these versions are very important for real-time communication in web applications, and this vulnerability was discovered by Thomson Rensma, and coming to the impacts, it may have high confidency and high integrity and high availability. And we can see the CVIT score of 9.8, which is very critical here. And from this CVS score is gained from CVSS assessment sync security team. In the past slide, you can see the vulnerability scan results is 9.8, which is very critical. So you need to make sure you have immediate and mitigate recommend. You need to have the most efficient mitigation techniques. And some of the recommend actions is you need to update the latest version of socket.io package, and you need to ensure it may update immediately. And for developer responsibility is he needs to make sure that he is not having any malicious code in functions inside the code which may affect the vulnerability and block the vulnerability. And you can see one of the example here for verifying the payloads. This may helps to block the vulnerability here, where it may listens to a connection and checks the type of the received payload, and the validation is not a buffer object. The server disconnects the socket to prevent any potential exploitation. You see some of the patches are fixed here, like the 4.2.1 version and the 3.3.3 versions are all fixed. And developer makes sure that they have the right package and the latest version of the package of socket.io framework, and they need to be upgrade to the latest package immediately. And it's very important for securing the company's database. More timeline of the events of this vulnerability, like this vulnerability was found on April 29, 2022, and it was fixed on February 22nd, 2023. And as you can see, it almost take 1 year to detect and to mitigate and to recommend this vulnerability. You can see its injection continues to be one of the most critical software vulnerabilities, posing significant risk to application security. The CVE 20222421 vulnerability underscore the dangers of inadequate data validation, which can lead to a server severe security breach and exploitation. To effectively mitigate these risks, developers should adopt best practices such as utilizing prepared statements, implementing some robust validation, and using ORM tools perfectly. I used to make this presentation, and we have collected the code error from these websites, from NVD database and the CWE database, and some GitHub repositories.